Alright, so recently I was reminded of this specific graph on the internet. It went kind of viral um, like a few months ago, but I recently was reminded of it, and I think it is a really fascinating graph that's kind of interesting, though I have seen quite a few bad takes regarding it, which I kind of want to discuss. Um, Personally, I'm not a huge fan of people utilizing this graph as a gotcha, but I do think that there is at least something to say about it, so that's kind of what I want to do for this video. So this graph effectively it shows different moral circles, specifically moral circles, as they differ from conservative and liberal individuals. So this one on the left here, this is the conservative one. This one is the liberal one. And effectively what these are moral circles. This basically just says the extent in which you are concerned with whether or not a specific group, whether right or wrong happens to that group. That's effectively what it is saying. So this could be different groups of people or animals as it branches out. This is from the actual study. These are what each circle represents. So, and how the graph is essentially read is that they told people to select one of these, and then whatever one they selected that actually included all of the ones before it, which is one misconception that I'll talk about. Some people think that the one they selected is the one that they have the most moral concern for, but that's not true at all. It actually just means that it's the extent at which they where they cut off their morality. So obviously you'll have like your immediate family, your first extended family, and then it kind of just branches out further and further, and then eventually you just get to like a complete like moral universalist perspective where you just care about everything, which thankfully it doesn't seem like much of anybody actually selected that, though there could be some. Personally, I don't think this graph is actually the best representation of the data. There is a couple more that I'll go into that I think give a little bit of a better picture. I do have some issues with the study as a whole that I'll get into as well, but first I just kind of want to address some of the gotcha attempts that I've seen from individuals from both sides and why I don't think that they're very great. So first of all, from the right, there's first this massive misunderstanding, at least when the graph first went viral, of what I kind of mentioned where, they actually care more about all the animals on Earth more so than their immediate family. There are some people interpreting it like that. Of course, it's Twitter, where you'd see a lot of this, people not actually digging into it, not getting all the information, just reading the graph with absolutely zero context, such as posts like this, which don't even mention what the graph has anything to do about, but everyone likes to act like they all know, and they receive bits and pieces of information and all of that, which is not exactly great. So obviously that doesn't work just from the foundation of not understanding the study at all, not understanding what the graph's actually showing. Now, this next one I think has a little bit more legitimacy. Obviously, I'm a conservative, so I am a little bit biased in this one, but I do think that's still an issue to try to utilize this as a gotcha. This whole idea of excessive empathy, which is basically just the idea that, like, trying to be so empathetic to as much things as possible comes at the destruction of your empathy for things that you in theory should have more empathy for, such as your family. Basically, like, possibly this could be focusing on outsiders at the extent of insiders. I think the illegal immigration issue could be seen as an example of this at the absolute extremes, where there are some individuals actually trying to defend, or sorry, not necessarily defend, but oppose the deportation of actual violent illegal aliens, which I think is absolutely wild thing to do, because though I understand that, yeah, it might not necessarily be great for that individual, you have to also consider, what about how that person has affected the people in the country that you live already. Something like that I think is kind of the best example. Now, why I'm not a huge fan of this particular argument is, first of all, it's not necessarily like a bad thing to care about more people, and on top of that, it's not like, and like you don't really have any evidence that this is actually the case. It is possible that they do actually split it up equally beyond the different moral circles. They split it up like that instead of like oh, they focus so much over here and then just kind of like forget over here, something like that. I think it's just kind of a dangerous generalization to make, even though I know a lot of people on the right like to point out, oh, the liberals, they love to have their moral high ground, their moral superiority, um, which of course I'm not a huge fan of either. I just don't think that that argument's going to really work. At least this graph is not going to necessarily be appropriate as a gotcha. Although I do think that this is an argument that holds a little bit more ground than some others regarding this graph. And that's why I do think, at least as time has gone on, this graph does seem to be utilized more frequently on the right to support their position, more so than the left. It's much more popular, I think, primarily due to this number two reason, is the most common time I'll see it. But I do want to talk about some things that I've heard from the left describing this graph are oftentimes in response to these things that the right is saying. First is kind of just like the counter to number two, this whole idea that, or this whole moral high ground position, they're kind of saying that, oh, because we care about more things, we actually have more empathy. I think that this is just a complete kind of falsity. This whole idea of like, oh, caring about more things inherently means you have more empathy, when it actually could just mean, oh, I like, gosh, what was I going to say about this? It's something like we'll just say like there's a hypothetical maximum empathy that people can give out, and like some people might put their empathy like all the way to 12, and they equally spread it out through all of that. Other people, however, might spread it out only through this much, but it might be more condensed, more powerful. So it's effectively like they equate out. Obviously, this is an oversimplification of this particular issue, but I think that that is something that you have to consider, is that like just because you care about more people or more things in general does not necessarily make you a more empathetic person. Even if it might give you internet clout brownie points, and it might at least appear so at first glance that that is the case. So I'm not a huge fan of this particular gotcha that I've seen. More caring about more things does not necessarily equate to more empathy. And then the second one I've heard is the selfishness gotcha. This is basically a complete, it's a somewhat of a misunderstanding of the graph, but not necessarily to the extreme that I've seen from like the right on this particular misunderstanding. It's more along the lines of that they are like choosing hyperbole in interpreting the graph, where they're essentially considering this to be more selfish, the right to be more selfish due to its being closer to the center. And I think that that's just obviously kind of just blown out of proportion, because I mean, the first circle, the innermost circle, is your immediate family. If you have empathy towards your immediate family, you're not necessarily a selfish individual, even if in like other situations in broader society it might appear that way. It doesn't necessarily make you one. I think there's very few people that can like are absolutely like 100% selfish. They don't care about anyone but themselves, and I think that like there might be like, obviously like it is a case to that can happen, but I think for the vast majority of people, they at least have some people in their lives that they care about, and if they don't, they at least have an ideology or faith belief that contains groups of individuals that they care about. So this is just a misinterpretation personally, and this kind of goes into the first gotcha I was talking about, how it doesn't necessarily like having a more reduced like extent of empathy does not necessarily make one selfish. It just means that they might be focusing their empathy a little bit more. Of course, it's not all going to be all cases. Human beings are much more complex than this graph will probably show. And of course, at least for me, that I kind of just like, this is something that I've had a problem with, this whole moral high ground idea. Both political sides constantly seem to want to prove moral high ground, and I think that both sides in doing so end up just completely failing. They might appear extremely self-righteous in different ways. I find that most people that get mad about self-righteous individuals are oftentimes themselves self-righteous, which of course doesn't make it like a good thing. It's just like all self-righteousness is condemned, at least in the Bible, is what I believe. And generally speaking, I think that to try to claim the moral high ground in a as a political group, it's not really going to work, and because everyone has sinned and everybody deserves hell, so to try to claim that moral high ground is not really going to be able to turn out, at least not in the eyes of God. Of course, this is going to be an eternal debate, though I don't see this idea going anywhere, this fight going anywhere at all. And it's just kind of fueled by self-righteousness on both sides, oftentimes. So I also kind of want to get a little bit into the study. First thing that I thought was kind of a red flag is that it is 131 sample size, which is a pretty small sample to be a representation of all of conservatism, all of liberalism. Now I can't remember how to determine if a sample size is like adequate or something. I forgot like everything I learned in stats class in high school. But it just, to me, it feels a little bit small, and I mean, if you also break down the fact that, like, if we're measuring just conservatives, I believe the study was like something like 60% liberal or something like that. So that's an even smaller sample size for getting these selective graphs, which I think is not good. Speaking of graphs, I like this graph a lot more than the first one, for a couple reasons. One, I think it's easier to read. You can see these different peaks within it, which I think is kind of interesting. These kind of 3 different peaks that, interestingly enough, both sides kind of have that. I also like these graphs because it actually shows a little bit more similarity, at least at first glance, in the spread. But you can also showcase the clear differences with the concentrations here, which obviously does line up with the original graph, but I kind of like this one a little bit more, how it showcases, I feel, a little bit better the diversity within them. But then there was also this graph that I found on the article that I read about this particular graph, and this is basically just the actual the actual data broken down in, I think, a much easier to read way. So you can kind of even see this, though, is that if you look at these 2 graphs, like they're not actually that different. You notice like there's kind of like a couple peaks in each different one, which might actually suggest that there might not be too much of a difference at all in this particular issue. Of course, like when you look at these graphs, there does seem to be a pretty distinct concentration. These graphs as well, you can see, oh yeah, there's a lot more here, a lot more here. But like even then, like you'll notice like there is a little spike there on the liberal side where conservatives are, and even like there's a where most of the liberals seem to be, there's even a little bit of a spike in conservatism as well. So I thought it was kind of interesting. I think that this graph, and this at least makes it look a little bit closer than this first graph is actually going to give off. But of course, perhaps the extremes are where the issue actually ends up lying. These 2 extremes here, and I don't know. I thought it's just a little bit interesting. Anyways, that's just kind of my thoughts on this particular graph, because I love analyzing graphs, but I also don't like when people don't analyze graphs in a great way and use it for stupid reasons. Personally, I think that this graph, this top one here, this isn't really going to be useful in like an actual like debate setting. Obviously, just get like the study might not necessarily be super reliable, but on top of that, I think that this does a lot more support for individuals for their own viewpoint. I think there requires a certain amount of bias to decide which of these graphs actually looks better. And I actually think that, like, generally speaking, no one's going to win an argument or win somebody over to their side by utilizing this particular argument. I just think that sometimes inherent biases are going to make people think one of these looks better than the other. But yeah, anyways, I love analyzing graphs. I'm hoping to find maybe some more to look at, because they're quite interesting. But anyways, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.